So tell me who you are, and we'll go from there. Who is Lou Aronica today?
Today, I'm Lou Aronica. I'm the author of a whole lot of books. I am the publisher of a company called The Story Plant, which publishes fiction. I have been publisher of Avon Books and Berkeley Books and deputy publisher of Bantam Books. And I also am a partner in an audio drama production company called the Audio Drama Initiative. What audio drama is essentially like old school radio programs, radio dramas, but with much more contemporary sensibility and much more contemporary tech. So the idea is to create a sort of 3D soundstage to tell stories. And
so where do people find it? So tell us.
You can get our shows on Apple Podcasts. All of our shows you can get on Apple Podcasts. A few of them you can get on Spotify and Google Play and other places. But Apple Podcasts has everything, including we currently have a show that's really riding high right now. It's actually the first real Broadway level musical podcast. It's called Little Did I Know. We put together, it's a special team of sort of major Broadway talent all pulled together to do this thing. So it's pretty exciting, and people are responding very positively to it.
Tell me sort of how you're responding to your Corona quarantine. I assume you're quarantined, and what?
Oh, I'm totally quarantined. Yeah. In fact, I mean, other than taking the dog out for walks and going on weekend hikes, we are doing that. But there's so much space around here that you can do that completely safely. I'm staying inside. Yeah, to me, it's actually not all that different. I've been working in my home for more than 20 years now.
So you were sort of ahead of the curve, working remotely, I mean, again, like FM, because as we talked about last time, we wrote a whole book on how we were all going to take advantage of our smart technologies and have telemedicine and teleeducation and so on. So was that thought out, or was that just because it seemed more convenient and you wanted to be at home?
No, it was completely thought out. I did 20 years in working in skyscrapers and putting on a suit and doing the whole corporate thing. And when I stopped doing that, the first thought was, okay, I'll go out on my own for a little while, but then I want to sort of rejoin that world. And once I got to the other side of it, it was like, no, I don't want to rejoin that world in any way. And so even as we've set up companies and that sort of thing, we always built them virtually because there was no real need for everybody to be in the same place other than every now and then. And so there was no real reason to have an office and worry about that whole, the whole overhead thing that was associated with that, or worry about commuting, or worry about punching clocks and that sort of thing. So, so to me, as soon as I got the opportunity to work from home, I realized how much more I liked it. So I took to it instantly. Now I know a lot of people don't. I mean, there are a lot of people who have huge concerns about working out of their homes. They did feel motivation issues and that sort of thing. And for me, that was never a thing. I was commuting. I was just commuting downstairs from my bedroom as opposed to getting on Metro North and taking the train for an hour and 15 minutes.
So your first love, I think, is science fiction.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about, what you read as a child, or what you saw as a child, and how that sort of blossomed and how that enabled you to your career, really, or at least part of your career.
It had an enormous impact on my career. But I mean, from the time I was a little kid, I loved reading fantastic stories. I wasn't necessarily a huge science fiction reader when I was a kid. But what I found was that I gravitated toward the fantastic. I was a huge Ray Bradbury fan, even as a little kid. And what I loved about it was the remove. I loved that really good science fiction, as opposed to silly stuff where they're just people shooting laser guns at each other and that sort of thing. You know, really good science fiction pulls you just enough away from your world that you can actually look at your world. And I always found that extremely interesting. Even when I was a teenager, I just found that incredibly interesting to have that level of observation available. That was harder to have if you were reading stories about, you know, people in your own world or people in your neighborhood or, you know, relationships or marriages or that sort of thing. So it was always fascinating to me. Where it really took hold, interestingly, was actually when I got into the publishing business. You know, once I got into the book world, you know, one of the things that I always wanted to be able to do was work on books that actually said something, you know, as opposed to books that just entertained. And what I found was there was more room to do that sort of thing working in science fiction than there was in most other areas of fiction. You know, I guess if I, you know, wound up at a place like Knopf or something like that, and you know, could have been, you know, working with, you know, with great literary novelists, maybe I would have had the same experience. But outside of that, and since that opportunity didn't exist for me, outside of that, you know, what I found was that, you know, science fiction writers were writing about things that mattered, and I thought that was really valuable, and wanted to be associated with that.
So tell me about those authors or those experiences, or what they were saying that really spoke to you or enabled you to sort of, I guess, get the bug, and well, that sort of drove probably your whole both writing career and publishing career.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at, I mean, a writer like, you know, William Gibson, for example, you know, was really commenting way ahead of everybody else, actually, commenting on, you know, on how technology was changing us as human beings. I know FM was also writing about that, but I didn't know who FM was at the time. But that I found completely fascinating, because, you know, because it wasn't just that he was telling really good stories, because he was telling really good stories, but he was really he was taking a futurist perspective on writing fiction, which, you know, and to me, the best fiction, I do love fiction much more than I do nonfiction, but the best fiction has a really strong nonfiction component to it, that it has, you know, where the reader is learning something or is identifying something that they hadn't identified in the past, and that sort of thing. And Gibson's just a great example, because he really was talking about the sort of disconnect between humanity and technology.
Science fiction. I mean, FM liked to say that he wasn't a science fiction author; he was writing science fact. But one can debate that. One can debate that. So maybe science fiction, but then you have these different sort of philosophical type strands that have influenced this genre.
Yeah, and I think it's almost too big to try to encapsulate in any way. I think, you know, I mean, look, my definition, and I was always, my rap when I first got into the science fiction publishing business was that I wanted it to be as all encompassing as possible, because I wanted to be able to publish as widely as possible. You know, so, you know, Lewis Carroll is a fantasist, you know, and that's really, I think, when I talk about, you know, science fiction, I'm really talking about fantastic fiction. You know, because, you know, technically science fiction should have a scientific base to it. There should actually be some scientific logic if you're going to use the term science fiction, which decidedly doesn't have. But there are, and you know, so I think, you know, you could narrow, you know, the term science fiction down, you know, very tightly around people who are writing, you know, with a strong technology focus in their work. But if you open it up, which I prefer to do, you know, it really is, it's any kind of fiction that allows the writer to suspend the laws of physics in some way, in order to in order to make a literary statement. And so, you really can, I mean, certainly Orwell, to me, Orwell's a science fiction writer. I mean, Margaret Atwood would always talk about how, she didn't write science fiction, but so many of her books really are. And certainly The Handmaid's Tale is certainly a science fiction novel. There's this whole sort of, line of literature that extends through science fiction, which is sociological fiction, where you do see books like Brave New World and 1984, but also books by real science, writers who acknowledge that they're science fiction writers, like like a book like Last Babylon or something like that. Kurt Vonnegut famously refused to acknowledge that he was a science fiction writer, but he basically defined science fiction. So I think the category, to me, the category should embrace as much non-rational fiction as possible, and that extends, it extends in one direction toward fantasy, which is is largely just about making up magical worlds, although the best fantasy writers have very strict rules to the worlds that they create. And on the other side, toward hard science fiction, where authors try to extrapolate from the physical laws that we know. So a writer like Arthur Clarke, for example.
To get back to the idea of transhumanism as sort of I define it, or others have defined it, which is that we're in this transition stage in our humanity, waiting to evolve to some sort of post-human being. But when did you first hear about that? And that, that comes with all sorts of, elements that, that are part of the sort of the greater milieu, space colonization, cryonics, biological enhancements, non-biological enhancements, ways that we can survive various disasters, all of these things. So when did you first sort of become aware of the term? And then what's your thought process is on this in your own life, but also in your work life, as it were?
Well, I didn't actually encounter the term until probably late 80s. I know it had been around for quite some time before that, but it actually, for me, the term really started to resonate when the cyberpunks happened, because that was the first point in my experience where transhumanism had a really human face to it, because that was, and again, that's going back to Bill Gibson and the writers who followed him. But there, because you were talking about, tech, human hybrids, tech, taking over humanity and that sort of thing, that notion of where do we go next, was driven home for me more than previous generations of science fiction did, because I think there a lot of those conversations. There were certainly writers who were writing about the next generation of humanity and that sort of thing, but largely there was some external force that brought it on, encountering an alien culture or something like that. And the cyberpunks were really sort of looking at it from the inside, and I thought that was fascinating. But certainly there were nonfiction writers. I mean, somebody like Alvin Toffler even was sort of writing about in some ways about where we go next in Future Shock and the Third Wave and that sort of thing.
Most authors, I guess, partly because it's I guess easier to create conflict, and we talked a lot about this, I don't want to spend too much time on this, tend to go for the dark. How much of that, I mean, I mean, I imagine we're going to see a lot more of that. But what do you think of that choice, and how do you talk to your writers? I know that you're not working with that many science fiction writers, I don't think, right? But
No,
but you still
not many at all right now.
But like, if you were, like, what are your thoughts on dystopia versus?
One is the personal perspective, which I think is it is helpful to everyone to look at the optimistic perspective, at least on occasion, and hopefully more often than that. And then I think there's the commercial perspective, which is that I think it's sort of the whole dystopian thing is sort of done. There are only so many iterations of that story. And actually, there are way more iterations available of the optimistic story. And I think there's a quote that's attributed to Stephen King. I believe it actually is Stephen King, where he said, if everything else fails, just go for the gross out. And I think in a lot of ways, the easiest thing to do as a writer is to go for the dark stuff, because then the conflict is apparent. But it's way more interesting to tell an optimistic story that still has conflict in it. None of us are imagining a world. Nobody who's rational is imagining a world that has no problems or has no challenges. And who would want that world? But it's the nature of the challenges and the nature of the conflict, and I think the problem with so much dystopian fiction is that the conflict is, the darkness is so profound that the best you can hope for is a tiny bit of progress on the other side, which, that's not the world I want to see. And it's not necessarily the fiction I want to read. I published years ago, this is many, many years ago, I published a novel by David Brin that became a really awful movie called The Postman. And Dave was writing, it was a post-apocalypse novel. Something had happened. But he imagined this figure who, it was a guy who found a mail satchel on the side of the road and walked into town carrying this mail satchel, and people just congregated around him because the mail represented the future. It represented the past, but it represented a future. The idea that there was mail that people could send to one another, and out of that he builds a sort of future world. That to me was a way more interesting story and a way harder story to write than handful of survivors after an apocalypse, and they battle marauders, which is the sort of classic science fiction trope.
So I mean, we didn't talk about this, but we talked about it last time. I mean, you published the Star Wars anthology books after the initial
extended universe.
Yeah. So I mean, one could argue that those works, is this sort of space fantasy, and and there's this element of sort of magic and so on. I mean, do you think that has evolved? I mean, in that brand of science fiction, is there an evolution there?
There are way more touches of science fiction and fantasy in what would normally be called traditional literature, in contemporary literature even.
Do you think part of that is because, I mean, look, I think every generation says we are the generation, right? That whether you're living in the Renaissance or
right.
In everybody's like, this is the generation. And yet we look in terms of our human history, I mean, we've had really profound changes, and they seem to be happening quicker than ever before. But that could be just because we're so egomaniacal, about our time. I mean, but that alludes to it. If you're getting the sort of traditional novel that has sort of elements of science fiction, I mean, what's your thought on whether it's just us being narcissistic as human beings, saying this is the most pivotal period in human history, or is there something to it?
Well, you could certainly argue whether this is the most pivotal period or not. You can't argue whether it's the most quickly advancing period. You know, I mean, there's really, you know, there's nothing in terms of the access to information, in terms of the medical progress, in terms of technological progress. And I think there's something, and I think it's one of the reasons why more people need to read fiction, actually, because I think the change is so dizzying. The pace of change is so dizzying that there's a kind of need for an ongoing reminder of who we are at core. You know, because I don't necessarily think that, I think there's social changes that have affected how we think, but I don't know that there are really fundamental changes that affect who we are as human beings that have made that are fundamentally different from what they were at the turn of the 20th century.
What themes have been overplayed, or you know, we've talked about some of them, and what do you think thematically has you know, is going to go by the wayside in science fiction?
I don't know. I feel like, you know, one of my favorite stories to tell on myself is that I nearly prevented the acquisition of the first novel by Neal Stephenson, who's gone on to be this massively successful science fiction writer, because one of my associate editors came into my office, told me that she told me that she had this fantastic manuscript and that she really wanted to buy it. And then she started to tell me about it, and it was clear that it was a cyberpunk novel, and I had felt that cyberpunk was played out at that point. And I said to her, "There's no chance in the world. This is, you know, we couldn't possibly succeed." And what she said to me was, "Yeah, just read the first 100 pages. If you feel that way after you read the first 100 pages, then I'll go away." And of course, it was brilliant, and we bought it, and the rest is history. But I think so in the idea of saying anything is played out, I'm not sure, because I'm sure that anything is played out. I think there's always room, and I think this is a very optimistic thing also, there's always room for a writer to write a great version or an inspiring version of a story that suddenly brings people back to that kind of story. In a way, that's what Harry Potter was all about. It wasn't, you know, J.K. Rowling was hardly the first person to write about, you know, kids in a school of magic, but she just did it in such a great way that, you know, a whole new generation came up around it. So I don't know that there's anything that I would say is absolutely played out. I do think that audiences are kind of getting tired of dystopian stuff. I think they're kind of getting tired of cookie cutter stories, you know, where the author is basically using somebody else's tropes and just changing the names. And that happens, it happens in all fiction, but it happens in quite a bit in science fiction and fantasy. But I think we've only, you know, scratched the surface of contemporary and near future stories that use some of the elements of science fiction to tell, you know, to tell stories about us. You know, that was a 50s thing. That was something that there was a lot of in the 50s, and then it stopped being true. And then it happened again in the late 60s, you know, people like Heinlein writing Stranger in a Strange Land and that sort of thing. But there hasn't been a ton of that in a long time. And I think there's the room.
In the early days, there was some, I would consider, you know, real greats in science fiction. And I don't know who you think they are. I mean, you touch on a couple of people. I mean, Asimov to me has to be in there. But are there any themes of the early days of science fiction that deserve a revival to date?
Well, yeah, because I actually think you know, writers like, I mean, a writer who doesn't get, you know, inside the science fiction world gets a tremendous amount of attention, but outside is barely known, is a writer like Theodore Sturgeon, who was really writing about small tweaks to humanity that change us and change the way we look at ourselves. You know, I think that theme is one that I would love to see. I would love to see really good writers focus themselves on that theme for a while. You know, if you could send a writing prompt out into the world, you know, I think it would be fascinating to see. You know, even, you know, non-science fiction writers to, you know, just throw that in there. You know, because to some degree that's what Margaret Atwood did with the Handmaid's Tale. I mean, she took that, you know, that little turn and shone a light on who we were as human beings. I love that, and I think that was happening a lot. It was happening a lot with short fiction in the 50s. You know, again, Bradbury was doing a lot of it. Rod Serling was doing a lot of it in the Twilight Zone, and then it sort of, you know, went out of fashion, and it's well past time for a revival, I think.
What technology do you think that has arrived, I don't know, in the last 5-10 years, that's either changing science fiction as we speak, or is going to have the most profound influence on storytelling?
Wow, that's a good question. See, I think a lot of it is being explored, not necessarily in a humanist way. You know, certainly, I mean, it's impossible not to look at computer technology and project that out, as lots and lots of writers have already done.
I'll give you some prompts, and you tell me which one's you. If
okay.
Somebody said, here's $1 million to go and sit on the beach, for which of these do you think is the one that you'd latch onto? I mean, there's CRISPR, definitely should be in there. There's the Neuralink, whether you buy it or not. The Neuralink. Right. There's I'm just thinking of recent technologies that have come online. Well, we've got this. But this has been around for a long time. I mean, obviously, we've got supercomputers that can do we've got big leaps in neuroscience in terms of understanding at least some of the reactions that are taking place in the brain. There's probably some others, but if there's a few, and if you can think.
Yeah, I mean, all of the ones that you just mentioned are things that science fiction writers have been writing about for a long time. I think, that's why I say it would be fascinating to see non-science fiction writers address it, because I think this is where the literature, and I do tie this directly to the film. This is where the literature has an opportunity to take a big leap, because if you stop thinking of, if I'm writing about technology, I'm writing science fiction, or if I'm writing about technology, I have to write about the technology, and instead write about the technology as though you were writing a John Updike novel, then you approach it in a completely different way. And I think in some ways that's exactly what you did in the movie, because you were juxtaposing a human story against a tech story from a truly human perspective, not from this is a person being affected by technology, but this was a human story being played out against this technological backdrop. That, to me, I think is nowhere near saturation at this point. And I would embrace that in a millisecond.
That being said, and I know we talked about a little bit last time, but as you know, a lot of your job is marketing. Is figuring
Sure.
out the boxes that get ticked that you can put. How do creators deal with that if they are going to do something that sort of is either genre bending or doesn't quite fit or encapsulates different things? I'm sure on the one hand, you caution people. What's the caution, and then what's the payoff? What's the excitement?
Well, I think if I've learned anything about marketing, it's that audiences are way more open to things that don't align with the box that they're in than we give them credit for. But you have to be clear about how far outside of that box you're going. The huge advantage of our current marketing circumstances is that we can reach people in a lot of different ways. The downside is that those ways tend to be grossly inefficient. But if you accept the inefficiencies, as long as you're candid about where what you're marketing fits and doesn't fit into the box that you're marketing at, I think there's a lot of room to capture interest. And I think I think you're more likely to find interested parties. You know, if you have a mailing list or a Facebook list or whatever of people who, you know, who are fascinated with immortality, I think if you are marketing this movie toward those people, as long as you're also clear about all the other things that are in that movie, then it becomes an asset rather than a liability. Where I think marketers have made mistakes with things that don't fit into a particular box is where they hide that, try to pitch it just as the thing that the box is, and then the audience says, I wasn't expecting this. I don't want this. You know, and I think they wouldn't have if they'd just known that it was something more than that in the first place.
As we're all sort of quarantined and we're amidst this sort of global pandemic, you know, again, we touched on this before, that I imagine there's a lot of people going to explore pandemics and so on. What do you think science fiction can do, either, well, hopefully to make us sort of optimistic in the FM sense of optimism about the future? I mean, to me, the science fiction that I, in a way, responded to a lot was ones that gave warning signs, you know, like Handmaid's Tale. You know, so what can science fiction teach us, or hopefully steer us in a more positive direction than the one that we've perhaps been in? Certainly.
I actually think that it's sort of, there are two strains there. I think the strain that fascinates me is the one where we're placed into a future where some of the problems have already been solved. You know, where I think what I like about that is that the story then becomes about living through a society rather than creating a society. And I think what's instructive about that, especially, you know, look, I think we all believe that we have been changed by this, you know, and that there will be an alteration to the way we go about our daily lives that is permanent. And that's terrifying to a lot of people. It's, you know, it's a little scary to me too, but I think where science fiction can be really useful in that regard is to show normalcy against a backdrop of change.
Well, it depends what the change is. I mean, look, again, you see all these things. There was a big article that's getting a lot of attention on Twitter this morning that was, you know, literally saying that cities are done. Basically, we're going to have this urbanization. We're going to shut the cities as we know them are going to be done. And it's, I mean, I don't remember where it was published, but somewhere authoritative. Yeah. And then there's been a whole bunch of these sorts of things, from Mother Jones to The Atlantic to sort of the conservative media. Mm. And, you know, they really do paint this sort of bleak sort of near future. I have a feeling that FM would have said they would have been like flip about where we are, but I think he would have said, listen, like, we had signals of things that we need to focus on and we didn't focus on them. This is a chance to focus on them, you know, I mean, and that it's not going to be the new normal where we don't go out, we don't physically interact, and and the cities as we know them are going to dilapidate. It's not going to be as, you know, these sorts of projections sort of remind me of sort of half-baked dystopian fiction.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
So, I mean, how do you react to people in your own lives who are seeing this and really worried and really concerned? Because again, we are getting inundated with all of this stuff.
Right. I think the people who are saying it's the end of the world as we know it, I don't have much patience for those people. You know, the people who are having reasoned discussions about, you know, what we need to learn from this and how we need to adjust to that. I think those are conversations that we want to be having, probably should have had a long time ago, needed this in order to do it. And I think that, I mean, look, there's no chance. People want to be together. People want to congregate with one another. They want the kinds of things that you could only really have in city-like environments. That's not going to change. But we need to make, we need to address the fact that we've been living in a fairly unsafe way. So we're going to have to make some adjustments to that. But I would rather, I think that this is sort of the opportunity, the opportunity to do a good edit on society, as opposed to, I'm talking about that from a literary standpoint, not from like, I'm not talking about like eliminating people or anything like that. But what a good book editor does is point out where the fat is, and where a story goes off in the wrong direction and that sort of thing. And I think to some degree the idea of sort of giving us the opportunity, taking this opportunity while we're all stuck inside to do some edit on our society wouldn't be the worst thing. And there will be various versions of that. The thing that drives me crazy about all of these people who are trying to rush back to normal life is they're so ignorant about what the message was here.
Well, what is that? As the author of the message, what do you think the message should be?
Well, I think the message should be that we need to be we need to be more conscious of what the dangers are out there and way more prepared to address them. I think the big issue here, to me, the big issue here was how grossly unprepared we were. Yeah, and we're completely ignorant to, and took active steps. Not to get political here, but we took active steps over the last few years to be less prepared.
Sociologically, we tend to focus on dangers that aren't, from a statistical perspective, dangers that are so remote, and yet we tend to overlook, ones that actually, per the stats and per rational thought are much more likely. What do you think? And again, but you've written with a lot of sociologists and this sorts of thinking, so I can put you on the spot, in terms of that. What do you think? Why is that? And how, if it's the shift, if I might talk about shift in our outlook being the most important than the shift in our technology. So what do you think does that, and how are we going to shift away from that?
Well, I think what does it is, and to some degree what does it is ignorance, but also what does it is a demand for simple solutions. It's way easier to find a common enemy and fight that enemy than it is to look at environmental issues and look at medical issues and look at sociological issues and think about the gradual changes that you need to make in order to keep the society healthy. It's a way more nuanced, much harder idea to navigate. And I think, maybe if there's an upside to this, it's that this is now on the agenda. The idea of looking at medical issues and looking at how we congregate and all of that is now on the agenda. And while there's a whole group of people who will push it aside as quickly as possible once we're past this, there will be a larger group of people now who now consider that to be a key agenda item than there was 6 months ago. And so that, in a lot of ways, that's a positive thing.
How do we bring, as the publisher and editor of this, how do we wrap it? What's a perfect closing for this little conversation? Well, live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper works, but no, look, I think I think a world where there are more movies like 2030 is a very good world. It's a world that I want to see. and that's not it's not meant to be an endorsement. It is an endorsement. I endorse your film completely, but it isn't meant to serve as an endorsement, but more as a way of saying the more we're willing to look openly at possible futures, possible realistic futures in our near future, the better we are as a society.